It's a glorious day in Portsmouth, and I'm here with Giles on HMS Warrior, and I'm in the company of Andrew Bains. Hello, Andrew.
Hi.
You are what, the can't say it now, archivist.
Yeah, archivist, historian, general dog's body for Warrior, really.
Fantastic. Well, we're standing somewhere, and I'm, as the listeners know, I'm fairly ignorant when it comes to ships, so you can tell us.
We're still on Warrior's upper deck, and we're at the back end of the upper deck, which is actually called the quarter deck. It's all on the same level, but the areas are divided up. So this area next to the wheels here in the mizzen mast, the aftmost mast, is the quarter deck.
Now, this is a particularly interesting ship because it's, am I right in thinking it's the first iron armour-plated Royal Navy vessel?
She's the first iron-hulled armour-plated warship in the world, full stop, for any nation, yes. Right. Very important ship.
Powered by steam and sail? Steam
and sail. Governments don't change, and they're always interested in getting the most bang for their buck, if you will. And steam and coal is expensive, the wind is free.
Right.
So we have steam engines for doing the complicated stuff like manoeuvring in battle, getting in and out of harbour, and then when it's just a case of patrolling up and down, that's what we've got the masts and the sails for.
And she was in commission for something like 20 years?
22 years is a total real service period. We're commissioned 1st of August 1861 and we are finally decommissioned May of 1883. But during that period, about a third of the time she's out of commission, undergoing a refit, modifications are being made and that sort of thing.
It was a time back then in the 1860s, Victorian period, and we'd had numerous battles with France in the past and things were going on. But France came up with the first ironclad ship, and it was something that the Navy wanted to sort of get one up on, I gather.
Yeah, well, basically the whole idea dates from the Crimean War, during which point the Russians used shell guns against a Turkish squadron. And whereas in Nelson's day they fired cannonballs, right, big lumps of metal, hit a piece of timber, cause lots of splinters, but don't actually sink the ship. It's really difficult to do. The Russians come along with this French invention of the shell-firing gun, which hits the ship, then explodes, setting them on fire. And this wipes out the Turkish squadron at Sinope. News of this reaches the other side of Europe, France and in particular Britain here, and we get a little bit worried because we think the Russians are going to defend their forts in the Baltic and in the Crimean with these shell-firing guns, and to all intents and purposes our line of battleships then are useless. So there's a joint programme between France and Britain to design armour-plated batteries. It's basically just a floating platform that we can put loads of guns on to shell the enemy. Great idea. The French come up with not a great industrial base for them. They use a thin iron plate, about an inch thick, and that's separated from the wooden hull of their ship by some spacers, giving them about a foot, 30 centimetres gap between this iron plate and the hull of the ship. And on the inside of that gap, they fill cannonballs.
Right.
Great idea. Only problem is, as soon as a cannonball hits the side of this metal plate, it's not thick enough, so it breaks. All the cannonballs fall out, and your armour-plated system is rubbish. It's gone. So we're rather friendly, and our chief engineer for the Royal Navy, a man called Lloyd, is paying a visit to the French, and he says, well, instead of using this system, which is complicated and isn't going to work, why don't you use thick armour plate? Why don't you use 4.5 inches of wrought iron plate, like we are going to do in Britain? And that's really the idea of this floating battery. They're going to build some, we're going to build some. We're a little bit behind the French, so they get ahead and they use them against the bombardments of the forts of Kinburn during the Crimean War. Ours aren't ready, and by the time ours are ready, the war's over. So France, looking to capitalise on this advance she has, says, well, this is a floating battery, this is okay for shore bombardment, but what about for use at sea?
Right.
We need to build a ship that's protected with armour plate. And that's exactly what they do. They have a ship that's roughly the same size as Victory, a little bit bigger, and bolt 4 inches of wrought iron armour plate onto her sides. They have to reduce the number of gun decks they have so she's not top heavy, so she's quite a short, squat, ugly little thing, but they have the first armour plated seagoing ship. we get news of that very, very quickly. We've two options. We can either build something that is the equivalent of France, which sounds like a great idea and it's the cheapest option, but as soon as France finds out we've got one, they're going to build another one to give them two, so we need to build three, which means they'll build 4, 5, 6.
For tat.
Exactly, and it gets into an arms race, and arms races are expensive. So Britain's very lucky at this time. We have the world's really only truly industrialised nation, and we decide to put that capacity to some use.
Right.
We're not going to build something that is the equal of France. We're going to go 3, 4, 5 steps further down the line and make it inconceivable to France that they can take us on and win in a sea battle. That's the design brief for Warrior, and it's exactly what we get. She's about twice the size of Gloire, and she's the world's first iron-hulled, armour-plated warship.
She is colossal. I mean, as you come off, I came off the station, out of the Portsmouth Harbour station, and it's the first thing you see, without doubt. And you are just slightly blown away by the enormity of it. And I imagine in lower water, it's going to seem even bigger.
Yeah, I mean, she is the largest warship in the world in 1861. She's the second largest ship in the world in 1861, second only to Brunel's Great Eastern. So by the standards of the day, she's absolutely massive. By the standards of the modern Royal Navy, she's the 7th largest ship.
Wow.
If we were commissioned today, she'd be the 7th largest ship behind the aircraft carriers, the 2 assault ships and the helicopter carrier Ocean.
Good heavens.
So compared to a modern frigate or destroyer, she's still a very big ship.
And we're at the rear end, and there's, as you can probably hear in the background, there's repairs and stuff getting ready, I guess, for the season, because we're recording this at the end of April. Let's start over here by what can only be the wheel, I guess.
Yeah, we've got the ship's wheels here, and we have actually 4 wheels bolted together to give us 2 sets of 2 wheels. And we do this because she's a massive ship.
Yep.
They've got that side of technology right. They're very good at building steam engines. They're brilliant at doing masts and sails. They're not great at steering at the minute. And the rudder is actually too small, and it's all powered by what we term on board mandrolics, manpower.
Yes, mandrolics.
So we would need a minimum of 8 men on these wheels to steer the ship.
Good God.
And we could be talking of anything up to 60 men on the wheels, and then relieving tackles on the ropes that connect the wheels to the rudder to steer the ship.
And these wheels, I mean, they are huge, aren't they? What are they? 6 foot, 7 foot?
6 feet across.
I mean, they tower above me. Beautiful polished brass. I've been told that they've been polishing the brass here.
Oh, yes. Every day.
Every day, goodness gracious. And that they are massive. So as you say, how many people do you say in here?
You'd have a minimum of 8, really.
4
One on
each side
of each wheel.
Goodness gracious. And is that the bridge then?
That is the bridge. Now, originally in the Royal Navy and the other ships, the first steam engines were used to power paddle wheels.
Right.
Sat on the side, over the top of the paddle you have something called the box, and then to aid navigation, to give you a clear view, ship builders started putting basically a plank in between the 2 paddle boxes from one side of the ship to the other, a bridge across the deck. And that's what we have here. Of course, we don't have paddle wheels on Warrior, but we've kept the bridge because it's really rather handy.
Yes.
The whole of the deck here is surrounded by bulwarks, walls, which are 6.5, 7 feet high.
And it's not until, I mean, I took a little journey up on the bridge where Giles is now taking his photographs, and without standing up on there, you know, you can't see where you are.
You can't see anything, you can't see where you're going. And lots of people say, well, how did they see where they were going to steer? And the answer is, the men on the wheel are not the guys that decide where the ship is going.
Right.
They're equivalent to the power assist unit in your car steering wheel. Okay.
Yes.
The people, the brains, the driver, they're the officers, and they're on the bridge. They give instructions, and you are told to steer a course. So you've got compasses by the wheels here, and you pay attention to the quartermaster who's paying attention to the compasses, and you do as you're told. You are not part of the decision-making process.
So you've got the quartermaster at the front, you've got the 8 guys here at the wheel, and then you've got somebody up at the top at the other compass on the bridge who is giving the orders.
He's giving you orders in battle, or if we're generally sailing up and down, the orders are actually coming from the second bridge, the forward bridge, which is another 150 feet in that direction.
Yes, it is. I can just see it. Golly!
So on the wing of each bridge, originally there would have been a little telegraph, which was basically a board with a P or an S painted on it, and by using a lever, the master, the navigator, could indicate P or S, and that tells the guys which way to steer. It's as simple,
as that. Yeah.
And at night that's done by a coloured lens passing over a lamp.
Did the Warrior see action?
Never fired a shot in anger. She's not built to fight the French. We're built to scare them.
Right.
We're built as a deterrent.
Is there only one of these then?
No, we build an identical sister ship, the Black Prince, and the idea is that because we need to make a very urgent response to the French, we don't bother to evaluate designs, we just get 2 ships out there in the Channel as quickly as possible.
Right.
Once we've done that, we sit back a little and work out what works on Warrior, what doesn't work on Warrior, what's okay but could be improved.
Yes.
And then you spend 18 months evaluating the ship, and we have another brand new ship to introduce. And this is what the Royal Navy does all the way through the next 20 years. The ship classes are 2, maybe 3, but never really more than that, because each time we have a ship come along, technology is changing so quickly. It's like with a computer or a mobile phone. What everybody wants today, they're laughing at for being out of date tomorrow.
Yes. So to build a thing like this, it must have taken them a while.
Massive amount of time. By their standards, by our standards, they do it incredibly quickly. The government decide that there needs to be a response to Warrior on the to Gloire rather, on the 22nd of November 1858. That's when the decision is made to build something.
November 1858, okay.
November 1858. They spend a month designing the thing.
Gosh.
Okay, we get cold feet at this point. The government's never built an iron warship on this scale. Let's see what private shipbuilders who've been building in metal for quite a while, let's see what they do. So they go away, take 2 or 3 months. April of 1859, we get all their designs in, they're evaluated, and we actually say, do you know, we got it right first time round, we're going to stick with our original design. But we can't build it.
Right.
Portsmouth, Chatham, Plymouth, they cannot build iron ships.
No.
So we'll have to go to a private builder. So we take the people who did the best design really out of the whole lot from the private builders, the Thames Ironworks and Shipbuilding Company, and say to them, you've got the contract to build Warrior. Fantastic, they think. Only problem is, they've not got the facilities to build the ship. We've not got a slipway, a platform big enough to build Warrior.
No.
So they then have to build, in effect, the slipway in the factories that will allow them to build Warrior, and that takes them all the way the summer of 1859.
Good God.
So the end of August, beginning of September, we're not sure exactly when, the first keel plates for Warrior are laid on the slipway.
Wow.
The ship's launched in December of 1860 and commissioned into the Royal Navy on the 1st of August 1861, finishes the measured mile, the trial of speed at Stokes Bay in October of 1861. So from deciding we need the unit to having it in operation going up and down the Channel is 35 months. Which is very, very quick by modern standards.
Yes. But in their standards...
They were a little concerned. They decided it took too long. They wanted to have the thing built and commissioned in 11 months.
Good God, yeah. It's interesting you talk about the speed trials that you talk about, because I mean they sort of had those back in the Mary Tudor, in the Tudor Rose days. Is that presumably is a standard thing that you did with the ship?
You always test the speed, and we do that out in Stokes Bay in the Solent. There are 2 markers on land, exactly a mile in between the 2. And in Warrior's day, the ships would run out to the east, out past the Isle of Wight into the Channel, then turn back to build up speed and come thundering in at full tilt.
Wow.
And a man stood on Warrior with a stopwatch who starts the timer, and when he passes the second marker, he stops it. And then they run out towards the west, turn round and do the other thing. And they take the aggregate, and that is the speed of the ship over the measured mile. That's her maximum speed, which for Warrior, under engine alarm, was about 14.5 knots, which is very, very quick.
Gosh, and for such a huge thing.
Yes. It's 9,000 tonnes of metal and wood and men being pushed through the sea at about 16, 17 miles an hour. It's very, very quick. You need an awful lot of energy to do that.
And that's fuelled by coal, presumably?
All coal powered, yes. We didn't have oil power in the Royal Navy in the battleships until 1912.
Golly. And all those engines are obviously down below, and we're going to have a look at that. So just take me through, we've obviously got somewhere where all the coal smoke and dust and stuff is coming out, which you 2 funnels.
We have 2 funnels there, yes.
Walk down a little bit closer. So, I know they're drilling and stuff. And then you've got your 2 main...
Then with 3 masts on
3
board,
masts.
we have going... Well, 3 masts and a bowsprit. So right at the very front, the mast that's sort of sticking out at 45 degrees to the horizontal, that is the bowsprit.
Yep.
Then back from that we have the foremast, and then in the middle of the ship here we have the main mast, and then we have the mizzen mast.
Right.
So the heights above the waterline are respectively 169, 175 and 138 feet.
And you've recently had these painted.
Yes, they've all been
I know,
painted.
Sharon was telling us that you have abseiling painters.
Yes,
come
we've
along,
used these guys usually work inside of tanks and
Wow.
gasometers and things like that, so they're all in competition to get the contract to come down to Warrior because it's so nice for them,
Yeah.
especially the weather we've had of late.
Absolutely, yeah.
And they've been right up to the top. The highest I've ever been personally is the fighting top, and believe me, that's far enough. That feels a long way up.
The fighting top is
Which
what, this
is the
first
one
platform?
the first platform. It's about 100 feet up.
Gosh. Yeah, that would,
And from down here it looks rather big, but when you're up there it feels like you're on a tightrope, I can tell
I
you.
bet it does. I bet I'm not good with heights myself. Just going on the bridge I started to feel a bit queasy. All the ropes and everything are all black. Is that because they've been tarred? Was that what they used to do?
They have been tarred. Well, yeah, you have two sorts of rope, two sorts of rigging. We have what's called standing rigging and we have running rigging. Now the standing rigging is what we use to hold the masts up, basically.
Yep.
Because very long pole, it's like a broom handle. You knock a broom handle into the ground and then you push it and it'll still move about, it will wobble. So we have the ratlins, the shrouds as the term, which are these ropes coming down from the side of the fighting top down to the bulwarks, and then we have the stays, which are the large ropes coming back and forward from the mast.
Right.
So it's all hold taut to keep it in position.
Yeah, because these must be quite heavy bloody
Yes,
things.
they're
I mean,
very
they're not like
heavy,
the wooden
these masts. No. Well, we've got the masts and spars weigh about 112 tons all in originally.
Right.
These are steel and they are hollow, so they're replicas and they're quite considerably lighter. But if you can imagine that with sails and the press of canvas, if you've enough force in the sails to push the ship,
Yes.
it will bend the mast. So you have to support the mast. And
Yes.
the other thing is, as we roll over waves and we dash headfirst through the waves, you can catapult the masts back and forth.
Oh, right.
And that's bad news for the blokes that are at the top.
Yes.
So to try and steady them as much as possible,
Yes.
we have the shrouds and the stays.
Right. Oh, it's truth. I wouldn't want to be up there,
No.
particularly when it's calm, let alone in any kind of rough weathers. So, where would when it was in service, was it just patrolling up and down the Solent?
We are predominantly in the Channel.
Right.
Defence of Empire, yes, it's really rather handy to have the little gunboats down off Africa and China and South America, but the Empire really is maintained in Europe, in the European waters. France is our biggest opponent.
Yeah.
So that is where we defend ourselves, this small stretch of water between England and France. That's where she is predominantly based. Down as far as Lisbon perhaps, up as far as Copenhagen, but that's about it.
So, what was the French reaction when they saw this coming out for the first time?
The French reaction, well, to be honest, there isn't one. They've embarked upon this course of building wooden-hulled ships with armour plating.
Yes.
They don't develop the armour plating, they don't develop the guns, not through lack of ambition, but because they simply haven't got the factories. They
Right.
don't have the know-how to do that.
Yes.
And that's partly due to France being politically very unstable at the time, and partly due to the fact that Britain is very lucky. We are able to have a small army because we have a very large navy that can
Yes.
defend us.
And is that a naval helicopter going
That's a sea
overhead?
king going over.
So the French were intimidated by it, and they just, as you say, they didn't have the facilities to sort of try and match us and play tit for tat.
No,
with
they
naval.
don't. They don't have the capacity. They have to maintain a very large army
Yeah.
because of threats on the continent. And in the end, that's where Napoleon III directs his funds into the army, and
Yes.
they end up waging, of course, the Franco-Prussian War, which, come 1871, ends in disaster for them. Really, Napoleon III is thrown out of France, has to leave France. He
So
comes
when he
over
goes
here.
to Madeira, is it St Helena?
That was the original Napoleon. That's Napoleon Bonaparte.
Oh
Napoleon
yeah,
III.
I'm getting confused now.
Napoleon III, yes,
Yes.
he comes and actually ends up just around Farnborough in Hampshire.
Oh right, oh right.
And he was the Empress Eugenie, and he dies there. And their son actually dies fighting the Zulus for the British Army.
Oh gosh, they get about there, don't they? So how are you arming this ship, this magnificent large ship with its? I haven't described the colours here. You've got on the inside, on the upper deck here, you've got some very nice. What type of wood is this?
This is teak now, and that's originally it would have been a fir, Danzig fir, and the gun decks would have been oak. But
Right.
the problems with sourcing that material, and also the ship isn't now an active warship. Her
Right.
roles are different, so
Yes.
the materials we use are different. So this is teak because it's very hard wearing. The last time we replaced the deck was 2004, and that
right.
cost over £1 million.
Cool, Struth.
So obviously we want to do that as infrequently as
Yes.
we possibly can. So we choose a timber that's very hard wearing. So we use a hardwood that's rot resistant, which fur isn't necessarily.
And is that rubber that you've got in between the planks?
We have a modern boat cork, as it's termed, which
Right.
is a synthetic material. It looks like black rubber.
Oh, okay.
Originally, the deck would have been corked, made waterproof by
Yeah.
stuffing oakum, which is rope that's been picked apart in between the seams of the deck,
Right.
and then we pour pitch over that.
Right.
This is a modern system which will work with the expansion and contraction of the deck as it gets hot, whereas tar would split in time and not become waterproof.
So just going back to your oakum, that's the stuff that was handpicked by prisoners.
Prisoners ashore and on board the ship. They
Oh
would
right,
make
okay. So
that, yeah.
because I mean, looking at this, you would need a hell of a lot of it.
You do need an awful lot of oakum, yeah.
So you've got this lovely. What did you just call it? Teak.
Teak deck, yeah.
Yes, teak deck here, and you've got the colours are sort of an orange colour.
We call it a buff. We call it a buff.
Oh, okay.
The Navy of this time was known as the Black Battle Fleet because unlike in Nelson's day where they tended to have the checkerboard patterns and the black and the buff stripes along the side of the ship, Warrior's Day it's simply a black hull. On the inside here we have a white bulwarks, a white superstructure, and then the masts and the cowl vents and the funnels are picked out in this buff colour.
Right.
Just to give a little bit of lift, a little bit of colour.
Yes, absolutely. Because otherwise it would be very black and white, really, wouldn't it? So I was going to say, how do you arm the vehicle? How do you arm this magnificent ship? And we're standing by a cannon, and I notice you've got lots of different sized cannons. Well, not lots actually. Are there more below?
Yes, the majority of Warrior's armament is behind the armour plating, which exists from the deck down. So up here we're not behind armour plating, we're unprotected.
Right.
So this is, as you can see, it's
I
about
see.
8 inches thick, 10 inches thick, and that's timber originally.
Right.
So we have a couple of guns up here. We've got some brand new Armstrong guns, which are rifled guns, which means they fire a bullet-shaped projectile, and they're very accurate. They're accurate to about 4,500 yards, whereas smoothbore guns on Warrior maybe 2,500 yards. What we are stood next to here is quite a small gun by the standards. It's what, 5.5 feet long. It's a 6-pounder. That's the mass, the weight of the projectile, the little cannonball it would fire. And this is on board for training the captains of the guns on how to fire with the roll of the ship. So it's about getting them into the run of how the ship rolls from side to side, so they fire at the right point when the ship's on the horizontal. And it's also used for saluting. This would not be effective against a warship of the day.
Has gun technology moved on from the days of HMS Victory?
Yes, this is where we really see it beginning to develop. The largest cannon Victory carries is a 32-pounder. She does have some larger carronades, but they're not very accurate at all. They're a smashing weapon for use at short range. Our smallest gun is a 40-pounder. We have 4 of those on board, but they're not really classed as part of the main armament, in all honesty. Our main armament consists of 26 68-pounders. Now, they are a bigger version of what Nelson was using at Trafalgar, but we also have 10 brand new 110-pound rifle guns on board, completely different to anything Nelson or sailors of even 10 years ago would have been familiar with. Very powerful gun, built in a completely different manner.
Should we go downstairs and have a look at some of them?
We'll head below and have a look.
Very good, yeah, that's what we like.
Right, okay, so what deck is this, Andrew?
We've come down now, we're onto the main deck, and the central 216 feet of the main deck is called the gun deck. This is the armoured citadel, the armoured part of the ship.
I can see why it's called the gun deck. You know, when you go upstairs on the upper deck, you are a little bit deceived and you think, oh, there's not that much here. And then in terms of armament, as you so eruditely explained, and here we are now, and it just goes on and on and on with these massive, great big guns.
Well, you can see, I say it's 216 feet long, and every 15 feet along each side of the deck we have what is, to all intents and purposes, a gun weighing 6 tons on its gun carriage. The guns weigh just over 5 tons themselves, and the gun carriage is 1.1 tons, so it's more or less 6 tons weight. It would require 19 and a half men to operate these things.
19 and a half men?
19 and a half men. People ask, are they the powder monkeys? No, they're not. We have one chap for every 2 guns whose job it is to go and get the gunpowder.
Right, so it's a shared man.
Yes.
I mean, I'm just looking at this massive. We're at gun number 13, which is a good number to be stood behind. Beautifully, I have to say, it's in such immaculate condition. Everything in here is, you know, the gun is beautifully painted in a matte black. But at the back of this one, there is this huge rope that goes through a ring at the back, which is a bit like a key ring in a way. That's obviously, and it's tied to the side of the front of the ship. That's holding the gun from recoiling, I suppose.
Basically, yes. We don't want to stop it recoiling, but we want to stop it recoiling too far.
Right. Yes.
Okay.
You wouldn't want to be behind it.
We can use up to 16 pounds of black powder when we're firing one of these projectiles. Now, that will throw a cannonball out at about 1,100 miles an hour. And as anyone who's done GCSE science or physics will tell you, every action has an equal but opposite reaction. Newton told us that.
Yes.
So if the cannonball goes that way at 1,100 miles an hour, the gun comes back at about 12 miles an hour, which doesn't sound very quick. Believe me, if it goes over your foot, it's quick.
Yes.
Okay. That's what this breaching rope, as it's termed. It's a big rope. It's 9.5 inches around this rope, and it's secured through, like you describe it, the keyring, which is called the cascable loop. Is its technical
the cascable
phrase.
loop.
And that is at the back of the gun, so it will come into the ship when it's thrown back by the force of explosion, but it will come back no more than about 5 or 6 feet.
Right. But, I mean, although you've got all that holding it, really the thing that's holding it is the nuts that screw into the side.
Exactly.
On your rings over there.
The rings are screwed through the timber you see here, and this is just a cladding to make it a bit more comfortable for the men that live in here, so you don't get a lot of condensation. The back of that cladding we have the iron hull. So the beams you see above your heads, these wrought iron beams, are secured to the ribs of the ship, and those bolts also bolt through the ribs of the ship.
Right.
So if you've been round Victory, you will notice that the decks are very close together.
Yes.
This is not because men are shorter back then.
No.
They're a little bit shorter, but not a huge amount. It's all to do with the weight and the power of the gun.
Ah, right.
The largest guns, the most powerful guns you have, are going to be the heaviest.
Yes.
They have to be the ones closest to the waterline, so they don't make the ship top heavy. If you stand up in a rowing boat, you make it wobble because the centre of gravity has moved out of the water as you have moved up. You sit down, the rowing boat's a lot more stable.
Right.
Same thing with the guns. We put them close to the waterline to keep the ship stable. The problem with that is, as we've described, they're tied off to the side of the ship.
Yeah.
When you fire them, all of the strength we need comes from the side of the ship, so the deck has to be close together to brace the side of the ship.
Right.
On Victory, if the decks are wider apart, if they were 7 feet apart on Victory, there's not enough strength and it would just rip the side of the ship in.
There'd be a massive hole.
A massive hole. So they're there for buttressing effect.
Right.
Here, being made of iron, we don't need that buttressing effect so much. So the decks are a lot wider apart. It's a lot roomier.
Yes,
You get
absolutely.
7.5 feet in between the decks. It feels quite nice and airy.
It does.
650 men would live in this area, so it wouldn't have been nice in the area.
But a bit
originally.
nicer than the
But
than
certainly
on Victory.
nicer than life on Victory.
So that's interesting. That's good. Now, looking at where the gun is pointing, this is obviously going through the reinforced steel plates. So
The iron plate.
The iron, sorry, the iron plate. So just trying to see how wide, I mean, that's almost like 3 foot. How thick do the iron plates then make to the ship on here, to the outer side?
The iron plates themselves are 4.5 inches, apart from around the gun ports where there's another inch on them.
Right.
They're 5.5 inches thick.
Yes.
Now at the back of that iron we have 1.5 foot of teak, which is really, really important. If we just had the metal plate, when a cannonball hit it,
It would make a hole.
all the energy that the cannonball puts into that metal plate would go along the bolts that we use to hold everything together.
Ah,
And they're not strong enough to take the shock wave and they'd snap.
Right.
So what we need is a sponge. We need something that will absorb all this energy, and that's what the Teak does. 18 inches of it.
Wow.
And it also spreads the shockwave across the structure of the ship. So rather than it just being on the one plate that's, say, 3 feet wide, it will spread it over a much wider area.
Gosh.
And on the back of the Teak, the sponge, we have 1/2 an inch, 5/8 of an inch actually, of wrought iron, which is the hull. And on the inside of the hull, we've got the ribs of the ship, and then the pine cladding, 1 3/4 inches thick. So as you can see, the size of the ship here are about 2.5 feet thick in places.
Yeah, wow. And I mean, it seems sad in a way that it was never tested as such. I mean, obviously for everybody on board, I'm sure they were very thrilled. But you know, you've got this magnificent state-of-the-art ship that goes out going, hey, look at us, we are the best thing since sliced bread. And as you say, it's never fired a shot in
nobody
anger.
would really test it. And some of the guys would have been pleased by that. I would imagine a lot of them would have been very disappointed, because these are all very proud of their ship.
Yeah.
And we want to, you prove your mettle in battle, and
they've all
nobody
been
will
trained
fight.
for that purpose.
Yes,
of course.
so the best way of looking at Warrior isn't really the equivalent of one of our modern frigates or destroyers. It's the equivalent of the Trident missile system. It's designed so that we don't ever have to use it.
Yeah.
If we'd have wanted to fight France, we would have built something smaller and cheaper.
Yes.
So it's designed to fulfill a very different role.
Yes. It's amazing, fascinating. So the whole deck is like this. Now I noticed you've got 4 more wheels. These are underneath the original. So you've got
underneath the
so have you got another 8 guys operating this?
No, we don't use both sets together. The set on the upper deck is used in fine weather and if we're not in action.
Right.
Weather deteriorates or engaged by an enemy, they come down to this set here.
So they're protected.
So they're protected within the armoured citadel. Anything happens to those sets of wheels, we get a free shot, a cannonball comes in through the gun port and hits those wheels. We have a spare set on the deck below us, so we have 3 sets of wheels.
It's well thought out.
Very much a belts and braces job.
Goodness. Behind the wheels, you've got a rack of rifles.
We have rifles on board.
So again, if there were cases where I presume they could fire out of the windows here if they needed to, or run up on deck.
If they needed to, realistically, these are here as a defence against boarders. We're not really thinking that we'll be boarded, but around every gun we have 2 Colt Navy revolvers.
Oh goodness,
and we have 4 cutlasses for the defence of the position. We would have Royal Marine sharpshooters on the upper deck when we went into action, but these rifles are really here for when we send our men ashore.
Right.
Naval Brigades, although we are not fighting with the ships, we are using the sailors. They're very well trained, so we send them ashore and they act as soldiers. They wouldn't like you saying that. They're sailors, they're part of the Naval Brigade, they're not soldiers. They'd say they're a lot better than soldiers, but this is what we're using them for. So on every blank surface around the ship almost, you will see rifles, you will see bayonets, you will see cutlasses, all for use by the Naval Brigades. And our captain, Captain Cochrane, most of the actions he'd ever seen, he'd seen fighting ashore.
Right.
The last command he'd had was in command of HMS Niger, which had been out off the Canton River in 1857, 1858, during what we now call the China Wars, what used to be called the Opium Wars, where we were fighting China. And he had led a party ashore. He'd been shot 3 times. He was shot in the ribs, that didn't stop him. He was then shot in the collarbone, that disabled his left arm, that didn't stop him. He led a charge into Canton with his one good arm, his right arm, and he was shot through the leg. And that eventually put him on the ground and left him to direct the rest of his men from a seated position.
Good God. Resilient fellow.
Ships of iron and men of iron as well at this time.
Goodness.
Very brave man.
Yeah, absolutely. So we've got a door here. I'm just eager to sort of have a nose in other areas of the ship.
We've stepped outside of the armour plating now. We've gone through a big bulkhead, a big wall, as you can see.
Right, with a
you can
massive
see how
metal
thick the
door,
doors
yeah.
are, yes. These in 1860, these cost £60 each.
Right.
That's the equivalent of a sailor's wage for 2 years.
Wow.
Per door, just to give you an idea of the expense. And you can see that these are about 18 inches thick,
Yes.
these doors
Yeah,
originally.
yeah.
We just have the metal part to them now. And they are there to protect Warrior against a raking fire through the stern. This is where an enemy warship would sail up along the back of the ship and fire into us along the length.
Right.
It's no good having armour plating on the
Either side
sides
if you
can
can't protect-
fire in
yes.
the front and back.
Yes, of course.
So we have these great big bulkheads which lock the central section off.
Goodness gracious. It's pretty amazing. And you've got here your cannonballs, again, around the, what would you call your staircase here? Your upper...
The ladderways.
The ladder.
So we refer to them as ladderways.
The ladderways.
They big companionways. So, yes, as I said earlier, if you have a spare surface, you put a gun on it, you put a round on it, a shell.
It's
a
amazingly
projectile.
spacious, though. I mean, compared to going round Victory, which is, what, a couple of 100 years?
There's exactly 100 years between
Oh,
Victory
100.
being laid down in 1759 and Warrior being laid down in 1859.
Right. And I mean, there's a lot more space here. And, I mean, I presume, where are the decks for where they would live? Are they
The
below?
men live on the gun deck, in
Right.
between the guns.
Oh, okay.
So when we walk back through there, you'll see that there's the tables in between the guns. They sleep on the gun
So
deck.
they
above
put
the
hammocks
gun.
up in the traditional...
Yes, everything
Oh, okay.
happens on that gun deck for 655 of the total 705-man crew.
Wow. These now, we're looking at different timber here on the floor. Is this some of the original timber?
This is some of the original timbers. We think this is original to about 1865, 1866. We know that all of the decks were completely relaid when the ship was refit between November of 1864 and July of 1867, and they had to do that for the simple reason that the Royal Navy is great for holy stoning. These are large pieces of stone about the size of a Bible, hence the name Holy Stone, with which the sailors would scrape the deck each and every morning.
Right.
Either dry, using it with sand, or wet with water to polish it. It gives the decks a very nice white polished look. It also wears the decks away.
Yes,
and
of
in the
course.
first 3 years, they wore 1 3/4 inches of timber off the decks by constantly cleaning them.
Good God. Gosh. I wouldn't want the job of trying to keep this ship clean with all those people on board. Pretty busy.
So this is also the domain of the commissioned officers,
Right.
which are 17 of the senior-most men on board. We have the captain's cabin, which is across the stern there. We can have a look at that.
Okay.
Did it ever fire a shot in anger?
No, it never fired a shot in anger.
Oh, it was all right, somebody, wasn't it?
Oh yes, and here we've got, are these cutlasses
These are cutlasses, yes.
in the
We
side?
have cutlasses.
Prepared for any
all around.
occasion, and a couple of different offices on the side.
Yes, we have here the commander and the master's cabin. Both of these would have been identical to, as you see, the one across
Oh, yeah.
the way there.
Yes,
So it
commander.
it has a 6-ton gun in there on its gun carriage. It has his bunk, and it has a desk for him to work from. The master is the navigator, in
Right.
charge of getting the ship from A to B.
You wouldn't want to lose
Back
him.
again. Not really,
Not
no.
really.
Not really,
But
no.
if you want to get home.
And on the other side, we've got the commander. He's the number 2 on board. He's in charge of the day-to-day running and the fighting capabilities of the ship.
Now I notice he hasn't got a gun in his
No,
office at the moment.
this office is now laid out as sort of a VIP entertainment area,
Right.
but originally it would
He
have
would
had
have
the
had
gun
one
and
as
the
well.
bunk and so on
And
so
would he
forth.
have to operate it?
No.
If
Fortunately for him, he's going to be up top,
Yeah.
giving instructions,
Of course,
telling
yes,
people what
yes,
to do.
yes.
So we'd have a gun crew here. All of these cabins will be taken away.
right.
So all the bulkhead partitions
I
fall
see. Yes,
out.
because they're not permanently
Everything's
fixed in.
stripped away, so we just have the gun and the
Right.
men for the gun.
Yeah. Gosh. But it's amazing. Well, it's all that planning that's gone through years and years.
The Royal Navy has spent 200-300 years doing this.
They know
So
how
they're
to do it,
getting
yeah.
very, very good at it by
Yeah.
this point.
Yeah,
very
absolutely,
good at it at this
yeah.
point. Is that on? So we have the captain's day cabin here, as it's
Wow.
termed.
And you set the alarm off.
Yes. It's okay. The man in control will isolate that for me.
He'll come down and have a shot, or run us through with a cutlass. Suddenly, you go away from warship into a very nice Victorian hotel type situation.
Victorian splendour, and this is because, as well as being a warship, and he a captain, this is a floating embassy, and he is a roving ambassador.
Of course he is.
So,
yes.
for example, we have the General Garibaldi of squash fly biscuit fame on board. He dines with Captain Cochrane. A beast has been slaughtered from earlier in the week, and he sits there and he's very much impressed by Britain and very much wants to be a friend of Britain, an ally of Britain. So his day cabin here is his office, but it's also his public area. It's his entertaining area. It's the equivalent of the Victorian drawing room.
And it's beautifully decked out. You've got this magnificent carpet.
You have the carpets, you
You've
have
got
the
a
painted sailcloth on the floor, you have a coal stove across the way there.
Oh, now that's so ornamentally
It is. It's
decorated.
ornate. The tiles on the tiled stove, it's designed to impress
Beautiful
upon
stove.
anybody coming in
with
this
a brass
area.
with a brass funnel. Is that a brass funnel?
That's a copper funnel.
copper
actually,
funnel,
there,
copper
yes.
funnel, yes.
But it's designed to impress upon anybody coming on board the might, the wealth, the power of the British Empire, this empire upon which the sun never set. It's all designed to show off.
Yes, no, and it does. I mean, beautiful writing desk here with your quill pen ready to write those important letters and documents and invitations, presumably to heads of state or wherever. It's absolutely, and your bookcase is wonderful. You've got your table in the far end, ready to receive guests and sit down and drink and make decisions, etc., which is absolutely fabulous. And through here you've got an open door at the back which takes you away from this splendour.
And we go into very much a working area again. We have the ability to lift the propeller out of the water. As we mentioned earlier, the ship is a steamship and a sailing ship.
Yes.
And we lift the propeller out of the water by having a hole through the ship above the propeller, and this is called the propeller well.
Would you take the propeller away so that you can maximise the...
It reduces the drag.
Yes.
That's the idea. And also, we carry a spare propeller blade.
Ah.
Propeller blades can drop off. It's called throwing a propeller blade.
All right.
The Titanic sister ship, the Olympic, famously, she threw a propeller blade and had to go back to Belfast to have another one fitted. Now, with something like the Titanic, you've no option. You have to dry dock the ship, take the propeller off, bolt a new blade on it. On Warrior, we're self-sufficient. That's not good enough for us. We could be anywhere in the world. So we have a spare propeller blade and would simply lift the propeller out of the water. It takes about 8.5 minutes to do that.
Gosh.
Bolt the new blade on and then drop it back
And away
into
you
the
go.
water. And away we go.
That's amazing. And so this is this sort of chamber
This very large cylindrical
with
face
hundreds of
here.
rivets holding
Yes.
the thing together is basically a shaft.
Basically to allow us just to lift the propeller out onto the deck.
Wow.
And we also have here the other end of the steering arrangement. We've talked about the wheel already.
Yes.
Or we have here the tiller, or more correctly, the yoke arrangement.
Right. And that's
Which are the big black arms we can hear coming across about 8 feet from the centre line. We have all these ropes and pulleys and purchases here and the rollers to minimise friction. This is all for steering the ship again.
with a little red rag to remind you not to bash your head on
Not to
it.
bump your head, yes.
Which, when you've got no hair like me, would certainly do a lot of damage. Wow. And then you've got the anchor's chain, which is equally enormous.
Yes, this is the mooring arrangement we have now. Originally, we'd only ever normally have one anchor out.
Right.
Maybe two at the most, one at the front, one at the back. Well, today, because we've got cross-channel ferries going back and forth and tideways and we're connected permanently, we have 8 mooring points.
Right.
2 of those mooring points, if we were to use originals, would have to come all the way through the captain's cabin and out onto the half deck. That wouldn't be terribly nice for our visitors.
No, I
so
see.
we have actually used this central propeller well. We've wrapped the chain around it, as you can see, 3 or 4 times.
see. Right.
And that's what we're moored around.
Yes, so this
Now,
is just unique to
this
how
is
you are.
specific to our circumstances
absolutely.
today. Originally, we have a large black cylinder, about 5 feet tall there, 3 feet across, and that is called a riding bit. And that is what the chain is wrapped round.
Oh, wow.
Now, when somebody says that they're at the bitter end, That comes from this riding bit. It means you're at the very end of your rope, and the end of your rope is the piece of rope that is round the bit, the bitter end. That's
you didn't know that, did you, Giles?
I didn't know that, no.
And you've been at the bitter end many times.
Yes, quite.
Working with me, I'm not surprised. Wow. So how long would it take the anchor to get fully raised up?
We require 176 guys to do that on the capstans, which are out on the gun deck, and they're going to take, for the full length of cable, somewhere between 4 and 5 hours.
Gosh, that's no mean feat, is it?
No, it's not. And we have a small rope, a small chain that goes around the capstan, and that's what's moved by the men on the bars, on the windlass, which is what a capstan basically is. And then the anchor cable itself, each link weighs 44 pounds. That is tied to the smaller cable, which is called a messenger. That process is called nipping. It's done by the boy seamen on board between the ages of 14 and 16, and they are called nippers. And that's why children are called nippers today.
Good gosh. It's actually, there is so many nautical phrases that have entered the English language. And all mainly from the Royal Naval days.
We are a seafaring nation,
yes.
So everything, obvious things like between the devil and the deep blue sea, that's from the Navy, of course, but less obvious things, like as we said, like the bitter end.
Yes, absolutely.
A square meal, that comes from the Royal Navy. To touch and go comes from the Royal Navy. By and large, all of these.
So touch and go.
Touch and go is when you've run aground in your ship. You've just bumped over a sandbar or a shoal and got away with it because you've touched it, and then the momentum of the ship has carried over it. So if it was touch and go, it was a close run thing, but we just managed to do it.
Amazing. Now, how long have you been? I asked you off microphone, but I'll ask you again. How long have you been an archivist on the ship here?
I've been on board Warrior now for 10.5 years. I came on board as a volunteer guide.
Good gosh.
Whilst I was at university, and joined the Warrior Association, which is the Friends of Association for Warrior, and have just got increasingly involved across those 10 years.
I mean, you know so much about it. It's so great to talk to you because you're so enthusiastic. You're not jaded by it at all, and you're able to put it over in such an eloquent way, which is a joy to listen to. And you obviously love what you do.
Absolutely. I mean, the great thing about my job is that because this is a period of history that not a lot of people have studied, we've had some brilliant historians look into it, like Andrew Lambert, like Howard Fuller, and they've looked at the big strategic things that were happening. But when you get down to Warrior and how they actually did things and what they did on board, there's so much we still don't know.
Yes.
There's so much we're still researching, and there's so much on board the ship that we are changing still. From little things, we've had recently a clinometer, which is a scientific instrument they used for measuring how the ship rolled. Something specific to Warrior. We found one of these in the original, had a replica made, to big things like the ship's sickbay. My job at the minute is involved in researching the sickbay, what it would have looked like, how we need to furnish that area. And that's starting now. That's going to cost us £30,000 all told to restore that to its 1862
exciting
condition. It is, it's exciting, it's interesting, and it's nice to learn things that have been forgotten for 150 years.
Yeah, absolutely. Now, I read or I was told, I think Melissa told me, a fact that, is it true that the Warrior is the first ship that had washing machines for the sailors?
Yes, the first washing machine the first warship in history to have washing machines on board.
Is that down below?
That's down below again. She's also the first warship in history to have the equivalent of an extractor fan for taking the gun smoke off the gun deck.
God, I bet they would love that.
Yes, and that doubles as a central heating system as well, because
course,
we can take the hot air from the boiler rooms and pump that up into the officers' cabins and onto the gun deck, so that when it's -3 on a cold December night in the middle of the North Sea in 1863, we can keep our guys toasty warm on that gun deck using the hot air from the boiler rooms.
Let's go and investigate.